Hey, George, are you there?
Hi, John. John, how are you?
I'm pretty good.
Good. It looks pretty brutal out there in the weather.
Well, you know, I am actually, I changed the position of my camera for this talk to dramatize the unusual weather conditions here in New York lately. I was just reading on Bloomberg News, we have already shattered this January the record for snowfall in New York City. It's over 36 inches now. And the previous record for any month for snow in New York City was February last year, February 2010. It was 36.9 inches. The viewers of Blogging Heads may be able to see through the window behind me that it is actually snowing at this moment. So by the end of today, almost certainly the record for any month of snowfall in New York will be shattered.
Wow. So how much accumulation do you have on the ground?
Well, we've gotten 36 inches. So the difference between what we already have this month and the all-time record, which is February last year, which is a story in itself, is just a fraction of an inch. And as I said, it's snowing now, so we almost certainly are going to break that. And
yeah, all the snows we have kind of petered out, and now it's been cold and dry, but kind of pleasant.
Well, I don't know. Did you see there's an interesting piece in the Times within the last week on the severe winters that we're getting here in the Northeast United States and also apparently in Europe, both this year and last year. They're unprecedented, and there are some meteorologists who have been trying to understand that, and they say that normally there is a jet stream that circles around the Arctic, and it acts almost as a barrier. There's also a pressure differential between the Arctic itself and the southern regions, and the jet stream marks that boundary. And the jet stream has been quite weak the last two winters, and it's kind of drifting, and I guess its velocity has also dropped, and as a result you get a much more mixing of the cold Arctic air with the warmer southern air.
Yeah. Yeah, they often blame our really severe cold snaps in New Mexico on that the jet stream drops down and all this Arctic air gets dumped on us. And yeah, we've had nights when it's gotten down to, into the low teens and single digits as far as Fahrenheit temperatures, but right now it's like 39, predicted to go up into the low 50s.
Oh God, that would be so nice. I mean, it's not only very snowy here; it's also been it's been really frigid, and of course the big question that a lot of people have is this related somehow to global warming? By the way,
there's that old saw. Yes, like how much can you extrapolate from these tiny little data points of this year and that last year? And
well, that does seem to be the issue. So this piece I just mentioned that on the diminishment of the jet stream said that the Arctic region is extremely warm. It's much warmer than we are colder down here. So the temperatures are as much as 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit above normal in Canada and Greenland. It's been so warm that there was a cancellation of the New Year's snowmobile parade in the Canadian territory of Nunavut. And
and again, it's why they realize they should call it global climate change, since it's going to be warmer some places, colder other places. But still, these are the kinds of things that, isolated short spans of time, could happen, without there being global climate change.
That's right.
So that's what's so puzzling, I think.
Climatologists who are cited here, meteorologists, are some of them are saying that, of course, it could be related to global warming, and a big factor here is this immense warming that's taking place in the Arctic that's led to less sea ice than has ever been seen historically. But they say that, basically we're talking about two winters, and that as you said, that's just much too small a record to draw any grand conclusions about.
Yeah, and yet there's no way you can really expect, people to embrace that, and say, wow, this is the coldest winter I've ever seen here, and so what's with this global warming? Because that's the way our brains work. We make patterns on, hour to hour and day to day events, and in the power of induction, we'll just tell you one thing, and it may not be true.
That's right.
On a larger scale, or it may be true for reasons you're not. You have to be skeptical.
Yes, skepticism is, in general, a good thing, but it also can be dangerous if it becomes excessive.
Yes, which. Now, before we get into, you had this really, really good essay, I thought, in the Chronicle of Higher Education.
Yeah, thanks.
And
for mentioning
about
that.
Skepticism.
The Chronicle just got in touch with me last fall and asked me to start writing a column on a monthly column on science, and so
that's great.
The first one was just published last week, and it was on something that you and I, of course, have talked about a lot, on the need for skepticism in science, but also how skepticism can be kind of a two-edged sword. And I, as a teacher, and I do this as a journalist as well, I sort of feel like it's my self-appointed role to try to encourage people to be skeptical about a lot of very popular mainstream scientific theories and medical therapies and so forth. And so I feed my students all these articles that I have written and that others have written to try to show that much of what they may believe is actually quite tentative. And the piece ended up being about how my students would take this lesson and they learned it almost too well and ran away with it, and they ended up being skeptical toward me. They ended up being skeptical toward the mainstream
That's good, though, right?
view of global warming, which we were just talking about, and even about the scientific method in general.
Yeah, but I read some of the comments you got. You had this thing about the Chronicle of Higher Education. You get some really pretty high caliber comments.
Yes.
Even though some of them are. Yeah, and but I don't know. I mean, some of them. I didn't agree with the extremity in which some of them were expressed, but they were saying, well, why shouldn't you be skeptical of the scientific method, or at least think about what the scientific method is? And I mean, there's like really positive skepticism in which you're digging into something and trying to. You're saying, how do we know what we think we know? And that can lead you to a much deeper understanding of science. And it starts out with skepticism by saying, like, how do we really know that the universe is 13.7 billion years old? Or how can we really talk about anything, beyond, say, the solar system when it's all direct, it's all based on just little, streams of photons filtering through our telescopes, and, we're using our puny powers of human induction to draw these big laws, just like people are saying, well, it was warm for the last week here in Santa Fe. Maybe this is global warming, or it was cold out east. Maybe global warming's a sham. But it seems like you should be skeptical even of that, don't you think?
Well,
and of global warming, because it's only by being skeptical that you can dig in and see the very difficult process of combining numbers from all these different sources and data of different integrity, and coming up with the theory that's, one that's, really been worked on by so many people and viewed from so many different angles that, it's gained a huge amount of credibility and is accepted by most climatologists.
Well, that's right, and I think that what I also tell my students, and you and I have discussed this as well many times, is that the sort of below my skepticism, there is a belief that science at some point presents such overwhelming evidence for a given theory or view of nature that is held up for so long after being repeatedly tested by all sorts of different scientists with different reasons to be skeptical of that theory, that you really can accept that as a true statement about reality. So
right. So you'd say that about, for example, the existence of the electron, or the modern synthesis of Darwinian evolution.
Right, and even about the linkage between the rise in temperature recently and the burning of fossil fuels by humans. I mean, I think that's beyond a reasonable doubt as well. Although,
I don't know, but
you're not sure about that.
When I say I don't know, it's not because I thoroughly understand it, but I don't really know enough about it to feel it's as solid as, say, certainly not Darwinian evolution.
Well, where the uncertainty comes in for me is, and it seems to me that the nature of the debate over global warming reflects this, is projecting into the future and trying to determine how much warmer the climate is going to get and what the consequences of that will be, and whether those consequences will be really devastating or maybe quite manageable.
We know that's. There's so much unpredictability there, chaotic effects, and the chaotic as in the flapping butterfly wings, extreme sensitivity to initial conditions, and anything could happen.
But this whole question of skepticism,
just predicting.
What's odd about skepticism is that it can also be turned on itself. And this is one of the peculiarities of kind of radical postmodernism, is that the doubts that it raises about science and about any knowledge system can also be turned on the postmodern position. And
sure. So it self-deconstructs.
That's right.
Deconstruction and self-deconstructs.
It's fun. We've talked about some of the philosophers who represent this position. The one who was the most extreme example of it was Paul Feyerabend.
Oh, yeah, we've talked about him.
Yeah, he was this wonderful, wacky, very entertaining philosopher. I interviewed him for Scientific American about 20 years ago. He died in the late.
Right. And you asked his wife if he had denied the benefits of modern medicine during his final days or something.
And she said, "Of course not." But
the
way that
I could just see you asking that, trying to look, really kind of sincere, and yet, your notebook's there, and you're just waiting for good material.
Yes, that's right.
Standing there ghoulishly at the deathbed.
Well, I actually wasn't there. That was just a telephone conversation, but.
Okay. That would have made an even better scene in The End of Silence, if you'd been right there.
Well,
but there was something in your. I'm just kidding. There was something in your. I think this essay was really, really a nice piece of writing too. And you mentioned one of your students talking about Hume, the philosopher Hume, who, of course, I know who he is, and I've I'm sure read derivative explanations of his philosophy, but. I guess I really don't know Hume and skepticism, but according to your student, he's saying basically be skeptical of everything, and it made me want to go in and see what that's about.
Well, it was sort of the ultimate argument against correlation equaling causation.
Okay.
And so it's a very famous.
So Hume was saying that.
Pardon me. Well,
David Hume was getting into correlation versus causation.
Well, I don't think he used those terms. He's really talking about induction.
I think those seem like 20th century terms.
Yeah. Well, he's talking about the basic scientific process of observing something repeatedly. Or just a rational process of observing something repeatedly and then drawing conclusions from that about what will happen in the future. And, you see the sun rise day after day, and you can assume that it will rise in the future. You see a whole bunch of white swans, and therefore you can conclude that all swans are white. I'm sort of overlaying later philosophical discussions.
Yeah, right. That's like Russell, but yeah, it's funny how black swans have basically crept into almost every one of our conversations.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and it's
Wikipedia on Hume. The problem of induction, just what you said, that the skepticism about human powers of reason is his most pronounced. Understanding the problem of induction then is central to grasping Hume's Okay, yeah, I didn't really identify Hume with the problem of induction. That's interesting.
Well, the problem I have with that is the problem I have with a lot of philosophy. It's sort of, it's good to know these arguments, but then and learn them in college, and then you grow up and you put them behind you, and you accept a more sensible view of the world, which involves real causes having real effects. I mean.
Yeah, and yet all the time that this is one of my we both have our kind of pet themes that we're always harping on, and mine is that the human brain evolved to find these temporal patterns and to make connections between things and to find patterns that may or may not really be there. So we find patterns in reality and we impose the patterns when we don't find them, and it can be really, really hard to tell the difference.
That's right. And
there's no way.
And I didn't really dwell on it in this piece, but I think there are moral issues that are raised by postmodernism and some of these kind of radical doubts about knowledge that certain philosophers and other intellectuals raise. I remember reading an essay by Susan Sontag within the last 10 years, I think. It must have been after 9/11, although I think she was also writing about
She wrote some controversial thing about 9/11, didn't she?
She did, but actually what I'm thinking about might have been primarily about the former Yugoslavia, although she was talking basically about suffering and war and these very real problems that we have around the world. And she was talking about a French philosopher, and I'm sorry I can't remember his name, but the gist of his theory was that we know nothing, that we just have these representations of reality that are projections of our own desires and of political and cultural biases and so forth.
It's all shadows on the wall of Plato's cave, and we don't.
Yeah, and she said when you've got people out there who are dying and suffering, and these terrible, very, very real human conflicts, that it is irresponsible to traffic in these sorts of philosophies that undermine and almost trivialize the whole idea of knowledge.
So there's something very decadent about it.
Yeah,
and you're probably in a very comfortable position in which you can do that. And I don't know. It reminds me of, remember the old Werner Erhard and Est, and they used to have these bumper stickers that said "Visualize World Peace," and the whole idea was, we just have to visualize this, and this, we'll have world peace, and of course it's a good excuse not to do anything real, and of course, did they have those out there? These parody bumper stickers that said "Visualize World." WHIRLED P's PEAS.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Remember that the TM people also tried to levitate the Pentagon, as I recall, back in the 1970s.
Right. There's that wonderful description in Norman Mailer's book about the March on Washington. Yeah.
Well,
but getting back to less skeptical skepticism, I mean. Again, I think it's good to distinguish between, positive skepticism in which you're taking apart some long, well-accepted argument. Richard Feynman was famous for this, and I just recently read this new biography of Feynman, and he wouldn't accept even the most, accepted truths about physics until he had basically taken it apart and re-derived it in his own way, and almost in his own private language, and then he would, feel like he really understood the theory and had the right to build on top of that. Well, the usual thing would be to take something that's accepted as built and then stand on the platform and build higher from there, and without having to start from scratch, right on the bare ground. And then some people suggested that maybe that kept Feynman from doing more than he actually did, since his really great accomplishment came fairly early in his career.
It's really interesting. I was actually just talking with one of my classes about that, this week, about a split that you get sometimes between a scientific theory's comprehensibility, either by geniuses like Feynman or by ordinary mortals like you and I, and its power, its ability to actually do things that you want to do in the world and derive various applications from it and so forth. And I actually have doubts that just because somebody can really understand how a theory works, that makes it more likely to be true. So I think quantum mechanics, Feynman himself said that nobody really understands quantum mechanics. It's just...
Well, he meant understand kind of... I mean, plenty of people understand quantum mechanics from a purely mathematical standpoint, that this is why we have these equations and this is what these equations say, and why the world is like this or how you interpret that they don't understand.
Right. Except that, but you see what I'm saying. I mean, and this is something that also occurs in mathematics. I mean, I think ideally we want scientific theories that are both true and even beautifully true, elegant, and really provide this kind of flash of illumination when we're trying to understand the complexities of the world, and also give us power.
Because if it's elegant, it's kind of a hint that it's really this basic thing that's woven deep into the fabric. And
that's right, but much of
but again, that's just a leap of faith to to believe that the universe is like that.
Yeah, and the fact is that when you talk about the comprehensibility of general relativity or quantum field theory, let alone string theory and things like that, you're really talking about a very elite group. I mean, you and I personally, I can speak for myself. I've been writing about theoretical physics for almost 30 years now. I still don't really understand how general relativity works. String theory is totally beyond me. I've got a kind of cartoon understanding of it.
Oh, yeah, I don't think any of us mere mortals can have more than the cartoon kind of version. I mean, that's what Brian Greene is so good at. And he has a new book that just came out. I mean, pretty sophisticated cartoons and along with some corny jokes, but no, I loved his first book. I gave it a rave review in the New York Times book review when it came out. I forget what the first one was called, but
it's funny.
But again, I think one of the points I made in the review was, you read these things, and sometimes when you're writing about something like superstring theory, the best you can hope for your general audience, and I consider myself part of the general audience there, is giving them the illusion of understanding at a certain point.
Right.
I mean, you can get people to imagine that, we've all read Flatland, and we remember, four-dimensional cubes, tesseracts from, Madeleine L'Engle's children's books, maybe, and so we could imagine that we could sort of imagine there could be this 10-dimensional universe, and there could be things vibrating in 10 dimensions, and some of these would be strings, and some of these would be, like, say, a 6-dimensional surface, quote-unquote, vibrating in more dimensions than that. So you can start getting these pictures, and then when you start getting into, what do they call, Calabi-Yau spaces and things, and how the little dimensions are all, so first they say, you have to curl up some of the dimensions, 7 of them, and get them out of the way, since to explain why we don't experience them directly. And then it turns out they have to be curled up in these very, very precise, mathematically beautiful ways. So if nothing else, you're getting this amazingly sophisticated mathematics out of it. But for, us spectators following this, the best we can really do is just kind of get sort of a rough gut sense of the kinds of things they're talking about. And then there's a whole nother level that I don't think anyone but a few people doing it will understand.
I remember Dennis.
But that makes it really hard for me to feel like I could have the license to be skeptical.
Well, Dennis Overby, in one of my favorite descriptions of string theory was in Dennis Overby's Lonely Hearts of the Cosmos. He's just got amazing lyrical descriptions of theories in cosmology and physics. And in one passage, he talks about God creating the universe by playing on his 11-string guitar. And which raises the question, is God improvising or is God playing from a score?
Exactly. Yeah, is God just some three-year-old banging on the keys of this 11-string instrument, or his mom's trying to make him practice, and that's our universe, and then there's this 10 to the 500 power other universes according to landscape theory. And what you mentioned about general relativity just reminded me of something that I've been meaning to mention. See if I can find it. It was something that Lawrence Krauss wrote, and this really great thing I found in the Wall Street Journal that I didn't know about called Wordcraft. Mm-hmm. And they get different writers to write these little essays. I don't know if it's weekly or what, but they get passed around in this kind of listserv of science writers that I belong to. And someone passed one around by John McPhee, had a really nice thing about how to write a lead to a story. Mm-hmm. And he described the lead to your story as being like a flashlight beaming down into the story, which is kind of a neat image. But anyway, this thing is by Lawrence Krauss, the science writer. He wrote Physics of Star Trek, and he's talking about the use of metaphors in science. Mm-hmm. And the very provocative title of Lawrence Krauss's piece is The Lies of Science Writing. And so he starts off talking about metaphors, and his point is that these are never exact. They give what I call the illusion of understanding. He calls it something else. So he's talking about metaphors are useful in trying to understand complicated scientific ideas, but they have their pitfalls. And this has always been my favorite example. Consider the demonstration many physicists use to describe the bending of space by matter, which is general relativity, right? Mm-hmm. So, basically what they do is they say, imagine you have this big heavy ball, like a medicine ball or something, and this is the sun. And now you set it down like on top of a waterbed, and this is space-time, and it bends and causes space-time to curve. So you get that in your head, and you say, oh yeah, I can sort of see, how some heavy object would cause space-time to bend, and yet I think we talked about this in an earlier program. It's starting to seem like deja vu.
No, you sent me a link to that piece, but we never did talk about it.
Oh, okay, so good. So basically, it begs the question. You're saying, how does gravity curve space-time? And the point that Krauss makes is, well, you're given this metaphor that you put this heavy ball on like a trampoline or a mattress or something, and it causes it to curve, and yet you're already invoking gravity because that's what's pulling down the ball to make it curve. So it doesn't really explain anything.
Right.
And yet it fixes something in your mind, so you can go, well, yeah, I can sort of see, how something like that could be true, and then you're ready to go on to the next point of the theory.
Right.
Illusion of understanding.
The illusion of understanding makes the theory more plausible. But
right.
There are.
But it really says not. It makes it more plausible to a generalist who's approaching it through metaphor and not through mathematics.
Right.
But it would do nothing for somebody who really wanted to understand it.
Well, it's interesting.
Maybe first
I think you said before that you sort of feel unqualified to pass judgment on some of on string theory and similar theories, which are really their plausibility is a function of their mathematical precision and so forth, and how closely they relate to experimental data. As you know, you and I disagree on that. I think that you can still focus on certain standards of evidence, for example, that you ask of any kind of theory about nature, and that string theory for me doesn't pass those standards of evidence. I actually just...
well, yeah, certainly you can say. I mean, the fact that there's no way that we've still come up with to experimentally verify it.
But what's even more beyond the pale is what is the main topic of Brian Greene's new book. So I have a hard enough time with string theory. I think that string theory does not even pass the threshold of being considered as a scientific theory because it can't be confirmed, it can't be falsified. It's really... not testable in spite of all the hand-waving that proponents do. But in his new book, I'm going to hold up Galley's. I just have a Galley copy here. The Hidden Reality. The thing about Brian Greene is that he's so smart, and he's extraordinarily gifted as an explainer of very difficult concepts without resorting to mathematics. He's witty, and he also seems, some physics explainers are a little bit odd and eccentric, wacky. Greene seems like, although he's extremely intelligent, kind of like a regular guy who happens to have this amazing knowledge, and he's going to tell you about it.
Yeah, that's kind of the image that his publicist puts out anyway.
Well, he's very trustworthy. I mean, I've met him. I went to a dinner party that John Brockman, the science book agent, organized, and so I briefly met Greene, but I've also read much of what he's written, and I do think he's just an amazing narrator, and as I said, very trustworthy. Yeah. But in this book, he is asking us to take seriously these ideas that have always been kicked around by theologians and philosophers, and especially in this century by scientists. I mean, one of the first multiverse theories came out of quantum mechanics. It's the many worlds theory, which says that you've got a quantum formula that describes all these various possible histories of a system.
Right.
And one interpretation of this situation is that all the possibilities are realized in different universes.
Right.
Now, I always thought this stuff was really cool, but it seemed to me that, and I've known about it since.
But does that really strike you as being any more further out than superstring theory itself?
Yes. I mean, literally, it's further out. Because superstring.
So it's one thing to have a 10 dimensions of space, only 3 of which we can perceive, with the others, wrapped up in these kalabia little mathematical pretzels. But then if you go out and say, that there's like potentially an infinite number of ones where their wrappings are all different and with different physical laws.
And that's just one multiverse theory that comes out of string theory or brain theory or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, well, and it comes out of the fact that they haven't been able to, if they could find something like the Standard Model, which, this is an old-fashioned 20th century particle physics, something that basically tells you why some of the parameters are fixed, although it leaves a huge number open, like why the particles weigh what they do, and why there are, God, I just completely disintegrated there. I'm trying to think back to when I wrote about the Standard Model in my biography of Murray Gell-Mann. Why the neutron and the positron, which are basically one is a negatively charged version of the same sort of particle. It has a different abstract quality called isospin. So why one with isospin spinning one way weighs slightly more than isospin weighing the other way? You'd think they would weigh the same, being the neutron and the proton. But so anyway, I'm rambling. So in a way, the landscape theories, so they haven't been able to find within superstring theory a way to say why are there 9 dimensions and not 8 or 7 or 16 or 23, and this is a way of getting out of that, saying, well, we can't explain that because all of these possibilities actually exist or potentially exist.
Right.
in all of these, on this whole landscape of universes.
And you ask what
it's really rather brilliant, but I agree. I don't. How do you test it? But
you ask
it's really brilliant piece of intellectual bravado and mathematical
sophistry,
bravado.
I would call it, or hand waving, or sleight of hand. You ask what's the difference?
No, not to the people who are doing it, though.
Well, no, of course,
really,
but that's why my role. I know they believe in it, or I assume they do, and they're not.
No, it's not. It would be sophistry. It would be sophistry if, for some ulterior reasons, they were trying to convince people to believe this for their own benefit, like to get them to buy real estate in like the 45th universe over, where they say gravity is much weaker there and construction costs are really going to be.
Well, here, let me give you my theory of what I think.
But it's not sophistry. I mean, they're really trying to.
Let me give you my theory of what I think
understand
motivates
the universe
these guys.
and getting. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm stomping over your words.
Well, first though, I want to go back to the point or the question that you asked me. Why do I find multiverses even more incredible than string theory? String theory is at least about. I mean, according to string theory, I'm made of strings. You're made of strings. Our computers are made of strings. Strings are right here. String theory addresses the reality in which we live. Multiverse theories, by definition, address realities that are so distant from us in time and space, and even these kind of hyperdimensions that they supposedly dwell in, that we can never possibly have any direct experimental or even good circumstantial evidence of them. So to me, they are really totally beyond the pale. And what's happened sociologically that I find really fascinating about physics over the last few decades is that when I first heard about these theories, the physicists would always kind of present them in a sort of joking way, and they'd even be a little embarrassed by them. And it would be almost in the realm of philosophy or theology, and thought experiments. What if? Wouldn't it be weird if in the infinity of the universe there was somebody like you making exactly the same argument, except they had blue hair instead of brown hair, and this kind of stuff. And Brian Greene has got those sorts of, he talks about the infinite number of doppelgangers that each one of us have existing out there. All these different variations of our world that exist, but of course we can never know about them. These are pure figments of the imagination. But what's extraordinary is that Brian Greene and Leonard Susskind and Sean Carroll and Stephen Hawking and all these great popularizers of physics now seem to be asking us to take this seriously as real science. And let me go back to what I was saying before about how I'm having a moral reaction in some ways to postmodernism and to certain byproducts.
Oh, this is like Susan Sontag getting really mad at the postmodernists when there are people starving.
Yeah, and George, I'm having the same reaction. I don't know. I think my brain is shrinking and getting older, and I'm becoming even more of a curmudgeon, and I can't stand this shit. I used to love multiverse theories because of the flights of imagination that it encouraged, and now I'm so worried about what's happening in the world here. There's war, there's real suffering, there's global warming, there's poverty, financial instability. There are all these things. I've got children who are facing all these problems. And, and at the same time, you've got somebody as smart and talented as Brian Greene at one of the great universities in the world, Columbia, who is spinning these fantasies about other universes out there. And I think it's irresponsible. I think it's a distraction. I see it as very similar to religious fantasies of nirvana and heaven and Valhalla and all that. And they're distractions from the problems that we're facing in the world today.
No, so you think Ed Witten over at the Institute for Advanced Study should get up and say, the hell with the superstring theory. I'm going to join the Peace Corps and teach mathematics and the reaches of the Congo.
I'm not arguing that. I still believe in knowledge for its
or
own
he should
sake.
use his mathematical. Yeah,
I believe in knowledge for its own sake. In the same way that I don't think that art, I don't think that poetry, novels, films should be harnessed to some particular moral purpose, making the world a better place. But I think scientists do have a responsibility to investigate the world, to investigate reality.
That's what they're doing. I mean, not everyone. I mean, if you take all of the scientists in the world, what tiny proportion of them are doing superstring and landscape theory?
Well, it's some that have immense prominence and popularity that are writing best-selling books. I mean, Brian Greene, the people.
Yeah, but these are fascinating ideas, and they're possibilities, and it really comes out of you said figments of the imagination. Maybe figments of the mathematics is a little closer, but I don't know about the word figments actually. I mean, you really have this case where superstring theory. You go back and you trace the history, going back to like John Schwartz at Caltech, and even before that with who was it with in the time of Einstein that first came up with this idea of unifying gravity with electromagnetism using an extra dimension.
Right. Can't remember his name either.
Yeah, so there are a couple of guys, but you kind of trace the whole intellectual history of that, and then with quantum mechanics coming up with what by all accounts is this amazingly successful, incredibly precise in its predictions theory of subatomic particles, and then one of the interpretations was, well, instead of looking at the outcome of the collapse of a wave function, so we're basically the electron could be spinning clockwise or it could be spinning counterclockwise, and we have to think of it as though these were happening at the same time, and then you measure it and it assumes one of these states, and instead of saying it's random, you could say, well, the universe, you could think of it as splitting at that point into two universes, with Everett. So, it's kind of got this long intellectual lineage, and then you get with superstring theory, where really is, I think, to most physicists, the only show in town. If you're really going to go beyond the standard model and come up with something that unifies all the forces in this elegant way, it's going to be superstring theory.
Right.
And it looked for a longest time like this was going to converge on a single superstring theory, but then it started diverging into like a handful of different ones, which gave rise to M theory. And then just to this whole idea that there was no way that you could... they just couldn't see a way to find a law that would define why the universe has these parameters and not some other arbitrary set. And then you start thinking in terms of the landscape. But it's in some ways, it's like an intellectual tool that tries to, these people are struggling on the very crumbling edges of what we can know about reality. So, I think that's great.
Well, that's a nice way of
maybe
putting
nothing will come out of it, maybe, but we don't know. And
I think that if anything came out of multiverse theory beyond this kind of science fiction with equations that just titillates with at its best it's sort of when you're talking about infinite doppelgangers. We've talked in this program before about Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence. These ideas of multiple worlds either existing in time or through space are very, very old. Hindu theology also postulates an infinite number of universes. And I think they, at their best, they kind of evoke this extraordinary sense of awe at the vastness and strangeness of the world. As I said, my problem is that they're being passed off as being in the same general category as relativity and quantum mechanics and Newtonian.
Oh, yeah, are they? Yeah.
When I think
I can't remember.
Discontinuous.
Yeah, it sounds like you've read or are reading Green's new book, which I haven't. But yeah, I'll agree with you there. It's certainly one thing to present these as like, look, here's where, pursuing what seemed like this incredibly promising theory there's no real alternative. And Lee Smolin, will kill me for saying that because he has loop quantum gravity, which for all I know is a perfectly good alternative. And I've written about it and once even knew what it was. But
it's a very inadequate theory. I've written about it too. The problem is it doesn't. The last time I looked, it didn't include electromagnetism and the nuclear forces.
Yeah,
it's just a quantized version of
you'd think that was
gravity.
A problem. Yeah, we should get Lee on camera. So he's a good guy. But yeah. So anyway, and then to say, well, and look, this is like pushed us into this this corner, and here's what we see as a way out, and then talk about how this would just kind of change our whole idea of what it means to do science, and brings up all these questions of where physics becomes metaphysics, and if we want to be doing metaphysics, right. And if money from, it's one thing to have government money from DARPA and Office of Naval Research and all these institutions that fund a lot of cutting edge physics. It's one thing to have them, like funding physics, but if they're getting to the point where you could say it's metaphysics, then, you can't turn it over to the philosophy, though, because the philosophers aren't equipped to do it. So.
I think it's, again, I feel like a prig saying these things, but it's, it's never stopped me before that I was slightly embarrassed to have certain views. But I feel as though, we're at a time when science is so important. Science is contested as our best way of knowing reality by lots of different groups, ranging from religious fundamentalists to people who put corporate profits ahead of dealing in a serious way with things like global warming. You've got huge disputes over various medical treatments and so forth, where there are billions of dollars and human lives at stake. And I think it's a problem when these really prominent scientists at our top universities are shown what I view as a very casual attitude toward basic standards of evidence that you expect from science. This is the same.
Yeah,
I've also
but they argue,
leveled
they
this
argue
against,
about that among them.
Against the singularity people who, I think are even more beyond the pale. Although actually, no, I think the singularity people can put together arguments more solid than the proponents of multiverse theories, which to me really are in a class by themselves.
But these people, the people who are doing this, Brian Greene, Witten, the people, Susskind, right on the cutting edge. I mean, they talk and think about this problem of the epistemology all the time. What does it mean to have something? We're led this way by the mathematics, but we don't have the resources, by many orders of magnitude to test it. Where do you just say, this is where science stops? And,
right.
This is like an ongoing internal discussion, at least in the community. But maybe what you're saying is this isn't what's getting out in the simplifications and the popularizations, and therefore, it's feeding people's general skepticism, so some Tea Partier can say, well, yeah, right, global warming, these are the same scientists that tell us, that there's 10 to the power 500 different universes, and that my Aunt Ida, is a crocodile in one of them. And, so you can see how that would, but, kind of pulling back to the theme of skepticism and global warming, I wanted to be sure to mention this before we run out of time, although we've got some, it looks like. Here in New Mexico, we recently got a Republican governor who replaced Bill Richardson, who couldn't run again, and Hispanic female governor, a real first for New Mexico, and it turns out that she's a Republican, and very much it seems leaning toward the Sarah Palin camp of Republicans. But so she appointed as her Secretary of Energy for the state of New Mexico, which is fairly important because energy's a big business here. Oil, gas, and if they start mining a lot of uranium again, so she appoints Schmidt. He was an Apollo astronaut.
Yeah.
and from like Silver City, New Mexico, and has also been involved in Republican politics. So he's going to be the energy secretary, and then he's also been an outspoken doubter or even denier of global warming. So this is obviously not going over too well with the environmentalists. But let me see if I can find this. My friend Steve Terrell, who's a political reporter for the local paper, the New Mexican, wrote this column about Harrison Schmitt, and he went up back and dug up a radio interview that this guy's a 74-year-old geologist. Okay, so he went out and did an interview with some station in Arizona. It was like the theme of the station is conspiracy theories. Mm-hmm. And this is just someone who believes everything's a big conspiracy. So they call up Harrison Schmitt, and he dutifully, tells them what they want to hear about global warming, not only being untrue, but part of a conspiracy of communists who have infiltrated the environmentalists. It comes right out of that Michael Crichton novel.
Wait a minute, this is the astronomer? I mean, the astronaut?
No, this is the astronaut. Yeah.
Who's now the Secretary of Energy.
He is an appointee, and it'll be interesting to see how the warming goes.
And he thinks that there's a global conspiracy of environmentalists to foist this crazy idea of global warming on us.
That's the impression you get from this interview, and I see I pulled up the wrong column by Steve Terrell on my screen, but I'll link to it later. But so he's being interviewed by the show, and then people start calling in, and the people who listen to this show, the next thing is like, well, yeah, but what can we expect? The same people that are trying to foist off global warming tell us that we, landed a spacecraft on the moon. And when obviously this was all faked, and Harrison obviously, I think he was off the line by then, but in any way,
no, we can still blame him for that.
So he wouldn't go that far, obviously, but again, so on one hand you have really honest skepticism of global warming by someone like Freeman Dyson, whatever you think of his argument, someone who's really grappling with a difficult problem and trying to, dissect it and deconstruct it and find out, how we know what we think we know. Then you have someone like Schmitt who kind of brushes it off, on his great authority as an astronaut and a geologist, and then attributes it to, like a Michael Crichton plot of a novel about it being an environmental conspiracy with, who knows, probably the Illuminati are involved with this. Schmitt didn't say that, but and then you laugh. But then this is the same group of people who believe that the World Trade Center was an insider job, done by the United States, the CIA, maybe the Trilateral Commission, and so these people, they look at themselves as being the real skeptics. They're going to be skeptical against this global warming nonsense, and yet they'll accept some completely outlandish thing like, the World Trade Center being, the charges being, sent by the Bush administration, working for the devil or something.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point that there is a certain version of a skeptic that is really averse to Occam's razor and goes for these elaborate conspiracy theories that, first of all, assume extraordinary intelligence and competence on the part of government officials and others, and also an extraordinary ability to keep secrets from the masses. Whereas, obviously, to me, the simple explanation for 9/11 is just that, we had warnings that something like that might happen, but we just screwed up. Global warming, it seems to me that, a conspiracy on the part of environmentalists involving communism or, some kind of socialist scheme to suppress all businesses and the entrepreneurial spirit and probably take away their guns too.
Yeah, no, that comes out of Lyndon LaRouche too, I imagine, because that would fit right in with his, the hippies the hippies kind of rising out of the ancient Egyptian sun worshipping cults into the solar energy movement and trying to undermine industrialization because this is a way to suppress the third world so that the plutocrats can keep enslaving people, and this weird amalgam of conspiracy theory and extreme leftist politics with a little right wing thrown in.
Well, to end on what I hope would be a kind of upbeat note, or just to bring up something. I don't know if we'll end on this. Obama, I didn't hear his State of the Union address on, I guess it was Tuesday night, but
yeah, it was good, I thought.
I read about it afterwards, and he, of course, talked about the need for for alternative energy, for non-fossil fuel energies, and I think he said by something like 2035, he wants the country to be about 80% dependent on clean energy, and he included nuclear as a clean energy. And it seemed to me that nuclear power is one of the ways where you can create a new coalition of people on the right, of Republicans, who, of course, have always been in favor, traditionally, of nuclear power, and a kind of more enlightened, less anti-science people on the left, and in the Green movement, people like Stuart Brand.
We're starting to embrace that.
Right.
So that's true. That's a brilliant political move, and that's what impressed me about the State of the Union. I got the feeling, wow, maybe he can really pull off this reconciliation thing.
Yeah.
The way nobody else could. And, he's apparently going up in the polls again in popularity among independents. And while I guess his policies are remaining low in popularity, I think some people in the opposition are starting to see him as someone who's really making an honest effort to reconcile these deeply ingrained differences.
Yeah, I
there's
see
just
him
a wonderful ending to this.
I think he's the best kind of politician, which means that he's a pragmatist. He's not an ideologue. So if he was an ideologue, then he would be more like Al Gore and Bill Clinton were, because they didn't. I'm not sure if it was from conviction or whatever, but they were not friendly to nuclear power. And and actually, Andy Revkin, the wonderful environmental reporter who still blogs for the New York Times, has a piece recently in which James Hansen, the climatologist who was one of the first to ring the alarm about global warming, responded to Obama's State of the Union address and said, and he was glad that Obama brought up nuclear power as a way to get away from our dependence on fossil fuels, but he said, Hansen said, Obama's got to be much more aggressive in pushing for the nuclear option, because there's really nothing happening now, in part because of the recession, and of course it takes a while to build these plants, and meanwhile temperatures are getting warmer, and if nuclear is going to make a meaningful dent in global warming, we've got to get started right away.
Yeah.
So, what's interesting about Hansen is that he is probably the scientist who's been most influential on Greens like Bill McKibben, who are still very anti-nuclear.
Right.
Bill McKibben has a new book, Earth with E.
Oh yeah, we started to talk about that last time.
That's right. I think we just touched on it.
Earth spelled with the two A's.
Yeah, and
EAARTH. The idea being that we've already changed the climate so much that we shouldn't even call it Earth anymore. Let's call it something else.
Right.
Yeah, and you asked me back, then what? As I recall, you said that you were liking the book, and then you started really getting put off with this kind of. This solution was basically that we all go back to the farm and start growing our own vegetables.
Yeah, it seemed like a very, in some ways, it was a vision that might have appealed to me, I don't know, 30 years ago or something. It's
we did talk about that, and how neither of us would be very good at all at growing vegetables.
That's right.
And really rather have some kind of division of labor here.
Yeah, and the irony is that in some ways cities are greener than suburbs, than sprawl, in which everybody has a little plot for their own garden.
That's an argument that's been made very strongly by the Sierra Club, and
Yeah.
they'd rather have the dense, the so-called new urbanism, in the old Jane Jacobs walkable neighborhoods, but that too is, I don't see that happening.
Well,
I mean, I can see it happening in certain small, maybe upper class towns. I mean, you could get around to, a lot of places to shop and eat and, teach at the university if you live in Princeton, for example,
right.
or Cambridge, and, Santa Fe to some extent, but at the same time, the trade-off is that, when you have that many people crammed into these dense areas, that also has really deleterious effects, like the old psych experiments with the lab rats, where you increase crowding to a certain point, and they start going crazy and become murderous.
Well, cities can obviously be extremely dysfunctional, especially when combined with extreme poverty. But I tell you, I'm spending so much time in New York now, and New York is a fabulous place. It's a city that really works in spite of the gigantic banks of snow piled up in all the streets that have caused so many problems lately. I don't know. I just hope that Hansen, I'm sure he has tried to persuade Bill McKibben and the other Greens who are still worried about global warming that we have got to accept nuclear power. But
I bet McKibben won't bite.
Yeah, I wish, because McKibben really has he has quite a bit of influence over a very large international group of young people, and
he really does. I hadn't really appreciated that until this year. I mean, he's really moved from being a writer, a writer about the environment, and always one with a streak of advocacy, to basically being an advocate who also writes books.
Right.
And I started reading his book, and I just thought it was terrific, and I loved the writing in this really kind of brisk style and take no prisoners kind of approach. But about halfway through, I just started feeling like it was too shrill, and there was one point after another where I wanted to say, well, wait, here I am, someone, who certainly buys the mainstream view on global warming, not out of any special knowledge of it, but because I've, read enough about it to in seeing who is supporting this, to be convinced this is the mainstream view of the community of meteorologists and oceanographers, etc. But, at some point would come out and I say, well, is that really true? Can you really possibly establish that that's going to happen? And then I'd flip back hoping for a note to some scientific paper, but, I was just supposed to take it because Bill McKibben said it, and it started, really lapsing more like, sloshing over the edges into, just complete advocacy.
Right.
And I just wanted more of the science. But, on the other hand, you could argue that there's plenty of books that you can go to and read about the science behind this. And, this is not what McKibben was doing here. But
I'll make I'll make a pitch for another book that is not, I think the author would be the first to admit it's not as well written as McKibben's. But it's fascinating, and the science is really solid, although quite complex in places. And that's Storms of My Grandchildren by James Hansen. The guy who, in a way, started the whole debate about anthropogenic global warming 20-some years ago.
Right.
So,
God, I remember Bill Broad at the New York Times when I worked there doing maybe the first big, magazine profile on Hansen for the New York Times, Sunday magazine. You think how long ago that was?
Yeah.
Wow.
Hey, George?
Yeah.
We are an hour and 3 minutes, and I've got to go out and shovel now.
In 42 seconds. That's right. You have to go shovel snow, and I don't have to do that today. I did have to do it fairly recently, so I feel for you. And be careful.
Oh, I will.
This is how even you athletic hockey players can have heart attacks shoveling snow. There's just something specifically about shoveling snow that creates heart attacks.
No, I am very careful when I shovel because I don't want to mess up my body for hockey.
Yeah. But just take it easy.
All right.
Or get your son to come over and do
That's a very good idea.
John, it was great talking to
Same
you.
here, George. Stay well.
Okay, you too.